Simon, it's great to have you on the show today.
Thank you.
Hello, Simon, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, Simon, great. Yes, I can. And let's move on. First of all, I have to start this interview by getting your perspective on the oil price. We've seen some volatility recently. It came under $110 per barrel recently for Brent. Your thoughts on where it's going?
Well, of course, as you know, we at Platts don't forecast price. So I'm happy to delve into what we see as the fundamentals right now. And it is fundamentally a constructive picture. When you look at the world as we see it right now, there is simply more demand than there is overall supply, and that's a recipe for being constructive. The only thing that really weighs as a long-term bear is the state of the European economy. If the European economy collapses, and that looks less likely today than it did in the early part of the year, maybe we see some weight. But for now, the short to mid-term outlook from our perspective looks relatively constructive, relatively supported.
All right, and can you give us a perspective on the oil and gas space in Nigeria, though? And of course, there's a lot of talk about the petroleum industry bill and the impact that that is likely to have on investment. But your thoughts on the opportunities for investment in Nigeria's oil and gas space today as you see it? There's a lot of talk about bunkering in Nigeria, and that, I think, obviously calls to question the integrity of the whole oil and gas space. But your thoughts on investments that you're seeing from where you sit into Nigeria's oil space?
Nigeria is very well placed, incredibly well placed. Africa itself has probably, it is estimated, about 20% of the world's remaining raw resources below her soil. That puts Africa in general, and particularly West Africa, in a very stark focus when you look at what's going on. It's different, of course, the way that West Africa chooses to run itself. Nigeria is a huge exporter of crude, typically has been a premium crude, of light, sweet crude. That grade in of itself is not what it once was. What's interesting from a West African perspective, particularly more than anywhere a Nigerian perspective, is that Nigeria has not successfully in recent years been a refining market. So all that crude is exported. It is not refined locally, and then you're reliant on foreign interests to refine that oil around the world, Rotterdam, the US even, Middle East, wherever it may be, and bring back the finished product. It's interesting when you contrast that to countries in a similar position to Nigeria, when you contrast that to a country such as Saudi Arabia, perhaps. The Saudis have a similar amount of crude oil under their soil, an enormous rich resource for them. Up until this point, Saudi has not been refining a great deal in the kingdom. They have done what Nigeria has done. They have exported the crude and re-imported the finished product. They, like West Africa, like Nigeria, have a growing population, a relatively young population by European and US standards, and we are seeing certainly more demand. The solution for the Saudis has been to build refining. The first of a probable trio, maybe a quartet of new Saudi refineries is opening in Q1 of next year. That's very soon. What we don't see in Nigeria has been that investment. We don't see the investment in refining, and that has been the big difference between the two regions. The question for Nigeria is, do they wish to aggressively pursue a policy of building refining locally, or does the current position, the current status quo of exporting crude and importing refined products, which is certainly less risky, is that the better way to go?
What about the rest of West
Africa? That will, of course, define investment in Nigeria for a long time to come, the answer to those questions.
All right. I was going to note that at your forum today in Lagos, there was a presentation on what's new in West Africa. So maybe you can just start by giving me a perspective on what is happening elsewhere in West Africa apart from Nigeria. Of course, everyone knows about Ghana and the production that we're seeing coming out of that country.
Perhaps when you think about Africa as a whole and not just the Gulf of Guinea, oil is a truly global commodity. What's relevant for West Africa, therefore, is what's happening all over the world. And that's an interesting area. North Africa is investing heavily in refining. North Africa has, of course, been through a time of very deep change, very taxing time politically. There's been difficulty, civil war, nasty business. And as we come out of that, North African communities, North African countries starting to refine. That's going to be a significant difference. The Mediterranean region is going to become longer for refined products. What's interesting, of course, for West Africa, when you think about the product side, is really three markets: DPK or jet fuel, gas oil, and gasoline. Gas oil in of itself looks very constructive. The type of gas oil that West Africa has traditionally imported, the higher sulfur, simply isn't being produced in the numbers that it had been. That crack, from a West African perspective, the price that West Africans are paying looks like it will go up in the short term, the short to medium term. On the gasoline side, it's a little bit more constructive. We seem to be moving through a period of shortage and into a time when, over the next few years, we expect a lot more supply of gasoline, a lot more production of gasoline. What that means is that perhaps on a relative basis, we see a bit more weakness in gasoline, which is good news for an importing nation such as Nigeria, such as Ghana, such as a lot of people, Côte d'Ivoire, around the Gulf of Guinea. The DPK market, the jet fuel market, very interesting. A lot of pressure from the supply side, and demand from the aviation sector is coming down.
All right, okay. Thank you so much, Simon. Fortunately, we can't take this further.
You certainly do. One of the biggest in the world, in fact.
Simon Thorne, Editorial Director at Platts, giving us a perspective on the oil and gas space in West Africa.